Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kraft, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 3 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2025 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, talking about my top 16 rankings for both positions. So if you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, travel down to the description as I have timestamps available there. While you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel as I'm making daily fantasy football content in order to help you capture a 2025 fantasy football championship. So besides the uploads, of course, live streaming on the channel, I'll be live after today's game between the Buffalo Bills taking on the Miami Dolphins. The final thing I wanted to mention, speaking of this game, I'll be putting together a couple plays at the end of today's episode via Betr. Like you guys know, I partner with them for the entirety of this season, not only to provide plays every single episode, but it's Sunday morning rankings. For those of you who sign up today using code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of $10 and make a first time play within a real cash play. You'll be eligible to get on my email list and receive my Sunday morning rankings every single week for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, and flex for both half and full PPR. Check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your current eligibility. And of course, new users who sign up today using code Andrew get a free $10. So take advantage of the opportunity and make some plays tonight for the Thursday night contest. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's go ahead and begin. With our number one at the tight end position, we have Trey McBride, which is an obvious. He is a start every single week considering his contributions. 8 of the last 9 games in which he has participated in, 6 or more receptions. But the 2 most recent games in 2025, taking on the New Orleans Saints and Carolina Panthers, have been one-sided affairs. In the second half of these games, we haven't seen much of Trey McBride, primarily because of the leads that the Arizona Cardinals have been able to sustain. Luckily, this week they do take on the San Francisco 49ers, and this should be a back-and-forth matchup, regardless of who's playing quarterback for the 49ers. Now, when we're looking to project a potential upside for Trey McBride, we got to remember that majority of the statistics that he gathers is from the slot receiving role. Thus far this season, 77% of his receiving yards have been accumulated from slot receiving opportunities. Now, when we go back to last week and we take a look at how many yards and, of course, statistics, slot receiving options against the San Francisco 49ers accumulated for the New Orleans Saints, they totaled 12 targets, 9 catches, 55, and 3 receiving touchdowns. Juwan Johnson, of course, in this most recent week against the San Francisco 49ers, scoring 13.4 fantasy points, 5 catches, 49, and a touchdown. Of course, Trey McBride is a fantastic play this week. Our number 2, we have Brock Bowers. Look, Brock Bowers should continue to play well. Obviously, he's coming off of a bit of a knee injury. Obviously, he didn't look as athletic as he normally does, but that primarily could be because of the swarming defense of the Los Angeles Chargers, who didn't let him make any plays after the catch as they swarmed him, but he honestly just didn't look the same. Hopefully, another week removed from the injury, rehab, practice, rest is going to be enough to be able to get Brock Bowers back to his sustainable self, in which, again, he has an advantageous matchup this week that he could end up performing at a top 2 capacity. Taking on the Commanders is the 4th best matchup. They're allowing over 14 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends thus far this season. Kraft accumulated 6 catches for 124 and a touchdown against the Commanders for 21.4 fantasy points in week 2. It wouldn't surprise me if Brock Bowers was able to accumulate a very similar total in this upcoming matchup. The next and final tight end within the S tier for this week is Tyler Warren. He takes on the Tennessee Titans, and thus far this season, he's been able to break some records in terms of most receptions by a rookie tight end in week 1, tying with Harold Fannin. This is in NFL history. Additionally, on top of it, he is the first tight end in NFL history that in the first 2 games of their career have been able to accumulate 75 or more receiving yards in each of those first 2 games. Thus far this season, he's number 1 amongst all tight ends in terms of total receiving yards with 155. And when you compare the first 2 games of his career to Brock Bowers last season, Brock Bowers had 156 yards. They're 1 yard separate. Tyler Warren is the new Brock Bowers for the remainder of the season as a huge focal point of this Colts offense, taking on an advantageous matchup against Tennessee. The next player I wanted to mention is Tucker Kraft, who's coming off of a monster performance of 21 plus fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, in which in that game he was prioritized heavily, was able to get himself 7 targets, which again, within this offense is very uncommon. As I've liked to mention in the past, Jordan likes to spread the love within this offense, and he doesn't like to target a singular player, at least a 7 plus range. Therefore, if we're going to anticipate this number to potentially diminish, then so would Tucker Kraft's overall for upside. But I'm hoping that he'll continue to look in the direction of Tucker Kraft since Jayden Reed is out for a considerable amount of time for the upcoming weeks. Now, over the course of the 2024 season, there were only 3 games in which Tucker Kraft had 7 or more targets. In those games, averaging over 10 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format, considering, again, he has scored 2 receiving touchdowns in the red zone thus far this season. He's the number 1 receiving target within said category. If you're taking on the Cleveland Browns and there's going to be a lot of scoring for the Green Bay Packers, we should expect Tucker Kraft to get some opportunities down in the red zone and hopefully come away with another week of a touchdown. Number 5, we have Travis Kelce, who, if he makes that reception in this most recent game against the Philadelphia Eagles right on the goal line, he probably ends up scoring and has himself a touchdown for 2 consecutive games. As we approach this upcoming week's contest, they take on the Giants. This is an advantageous matchup, as we have seen. Zach Ertz in week 1, 26 yards and a touchdown. Jake Ferguson in this most recent week, 9 catches for 78. Again, the Giants are allowing nearly 12 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends thus far this season. Therefore, we would anticipate Travis Kelce to continue his streak of success as they continue to give him a solid share of opportunity. Very similar to 2024, but nothing close to what we have seen in 2022 or 2023 out of Travis Kelce. Number 6, to close out the A tier, we have Juwan Johnson. Look, Juwan Johnson has played incredibly well. He's number 2 amongst all tight ends thus far this season in terms of first read targets per game. He's getting about 6 targets per game as the number 1 read of the offense. As long as he's continuing to get this kind of an opportunity share, which amongst all tight ends thus far this season, he has the most targets with 20 total. Of course, he's going to be fantasy relevant. He's coming off a performance in which he had himself a receiving touchdown. If it wasn't for the drop in week 1, would have scored a touchdown in that contest, and now has an opportunity of taking on the Seahawks, who are the 3rd best matchup at the tight end position, as they're allowing 15.4 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends thus far this season. Again, the Seattle Seahawks have allowed 8 receptions minimum to opposing tight ends each week. Therefore, Juwan Johnson in a perfect position to succeed. Number 7 is Jake Ferguson taking on the Chicago Bears. Look, Jake Ferguson's coming off of a week of 12 targets, 9 catches, 78. Incredible numbers. But going into this weekend's matchup against the Chicago Bears, this is expected to be a shootout. The total for this game is at 50.5. So if we're going to have a back and forth shootout and the security blanket of Dak Prescott is going to continue to get himself a high volume of looks, then of course he's going to be fantasy relevant. Over the course of the last 3 seasons with Dak Prescott healthy, Jake Ferguson has only gotten more and more opportunity. Back in 2023, averaged 6.3 targets per game. In 2024, when Dak was healthy, 7.4 targets per game. And thus far this season, averaging 9 targets per game, which is an incredibly positive sign as we approach Jake Ferguson taking on a high-scoring matchup against the Chicago Bears. Number 8, we have Sam LaPorta, who's taking on the Baltimore Ravens, the number 1 matchup at the tight end position, as they're allowing 16.25 fantasy points per game in the category. Now, they have taken on teams that highly utilize their tight ends. Week 1 against Buffalo, Kincaid, Dawson Knox, and even the 3rd-string tight end up the seam made a huge play near the goal line. Additionally, on top of it, we have seen this most recent week, Harold Fannin and David Njoku dice up the secondary in a negative game script. Regardless, this is expected to be a high-scoring contest, 52.5 point total. Now, speaking of a 52-point total, you would assume that once the Lions are scoring 52 points against the Chicago Bears last week, Sam LaPorta will be implicated for more fantasy points. But unfortunately, the backup tight end Brock Wright scored a receiving touchdown, and of course, Amon-Ra St. Brown took care of the rest of the potential upside plays within the receiving category. Nonetheless, Sam LaPorta, a fantastic play this week. Continue to fire him up. Number 9 to close out this tier is Zach Ertz. Look, Zach Ertz, each of the last 2 weeks finding the end zone has certainly kept him fantasy relevant, but he's also still getting a pretty good target share opportunity within this offense. So whether we do end up seeing Jayden Daniels or Marcus Mariota, it doesn't really matter. Jayden Daniels continues to look in the direction of Zach Ertz. Since week 7 of last year, Zach Ertz is averaging over 10 fantasy points per game on average, including the playoffs. And then even with Marcus Mariota in 2024, Zach Ertz in week 7 and 18 in those 2 contests puts up 12.0 and 12.2 fantasy points, 4 catches, 40 and a touchdown, 5 catches, 44 and a touchdown. Expect for a lot of potential for upside, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders this week. Number 10, to begin the C tier, we have Kyle Pitts, who's been playing incredibly well. In terms of opportunity share within this offense, 13 targets on the 63 total passing attempts from Michael Penix, which is nearly a 21% target share within this offense, which again is highly valuable. When you continue on to potentially give Kyle Pitts looks, and he could potentially continue to reign as the number 2 receiving threat behind Drake London within this offense, taking on the Carolina Panthers this week should be a fun matchup. They're the 2nd best matchup at the position, allowing 15.65 fantasy points per game, as we have seen tight ends such as Juwan Johnson and Trey McBride take advantage of the opportunity for the last couple weeks here. Number 11 is Harold Fannin Jr. Now that we have seen what kind of level of production that he is going to provide every single week, we're firing him up blindly based on the upcoming matchups and his utilization within this offense. Thus far this season, in terms of first read targets, he's ranked number 6 amongst all tight ends with 4.5 per game. In terms of design target share, he has a 29%, which is number 5 amongst all tight ends. He's getting highly implicated, and of course, as long as this continues to be the case, and they're taking on the Packers, who are allowing 13.75 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, the 5th best matchup. Zach Ertz in the matchup against them, 6 catches, 64 and a touchdown. LaPorta, 6 for 79. Of course, the Packers versus slot receiving options, which of course Harold Fannin functions as the slot receiver of the Cleveland Browns offense. We have seen the Green Bay Packers give up 13 catches and 75 to slot receiving options of Detroit, and 11 catches for 77 7 and a touchdown to slot receiving options of the Washington Commanders. Of course, you're firing up Fannin Jr. The next player I wanted to mention is TJ Hockenson. We are hoping that Carson Wentz can potentially elevate his potential for success, or we can hope that the matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals can elevate him. As thus far this season, the Cincinnati Bengals have allowed 9.1 fantasy points per game on average to opposing tight ends without even allowing a single receiving touchdown. They've allowed 20 targets, 13 receptions, and 117 receiving yards. Therefore, this defense that has allowed the most receptions total in 2024 to opposing tight ends could very easily be put in a position in which, if Carson Wentz is looking for a security blanket, very similar to his days back with the Philadelphia Eagles being Zach Ertz, hopefully he'll look in the direction of TJ Hockenson. Number 13, we have Dallas Goedert, who should be returning from his knee injury. Again, he missed his most recent week against the Kansas City Chiefs, but back in week 1 against the Dallas Cowboys, 7 targets, 7 receptions, and 44 receiving yards. Again, the way that this offense has functioned out recently, Jalen Hurts is just trying to get the ball out of his hands and is trying to keep the chains moving. And as long as that is going to be the focal point of this offense and running the ball, a lot of play action opportunities will open up, and Dallas Goedert near the line of scrimmage will be one of the primary threats. Thus far this season, the average depth of target in terms of the passing attempts of Jalen Hurts has not been great. Therefore, we should anticipate a lot of looks in the direction of Dallas Goedert. We continue with David Njoku, our number 14. Yes, I have Harold Fannin ahead of him, primarily because, again, the way that David Njoku is being deployed within this offense and utilized does give him opportunities to find success, but it just really doesn't mean that he is going to be as implicated for targets as someone like Harold Fannin. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean that he is someone that I'm avoiding this upcoming week, as I do identify that this is a very advantageous matchup taking on the Packers, who have given up 6 catches for 79 to Sam LaPorta and 6 catches for 64 and a touchdown to Zach Ertz. So why not fire up, David Njoku in a negative game script against a very good defense, sure, but again, in an offense that is going to have to throw the ball 40 times this game if they want to compete at all. Number 15 is Hunter Henry. Look, we saw a lot of Austin Hooper in week 2. This was something that was very common in last year's overall deployment of the tight ends of the New England Patriots. But this week they take on the 12th best matchup, 9.4 fantasy points per game allowed by the Steelers to opposing tight ends. Once, in fact, the Steelers cannot stop the run, as they have demonstrated thus far this season, it'll open up play action for someone like Hunter Henry to take advantage of the matchup. The final tight end I wanted to mention is Dalton Kincaid. He takes on the Dolphins, that are the 11th best matchup, allowing over 10 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Last time out against the Dolphins, he had 10 targets in 2024. Obviously, only was able to make 4 receptions, but the opportunity in the game plan was to get him involved. Later today, when I put together a play via Betr, I'm going more than 24 and a half receiving yards for Dalton Kincaid. I believe it's a really advantageous number considering he's been able to accomplish it already thus far this season twice, but also in each of the last 4 games against the Miami Dolphins. Now, before we continue on and begin talking about the quarterback conversation, just want to go ahead and share with you guys some of the statistics I was referring to over the course of today's episode in regards to the fantasy points per game allowed to opposing tight ends based on receiving statistics isolated. That's receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. As you can see, the Baltimore Ravens the most advantageous matchup, allowing 16.25 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, while on the other end of the spectrum, the Atlanta Falcons have only given up 1 reception to opposing tight ends, so keep that in mind. Obviously, they played against TJ Hockenson in week 2, and back in week 1, of course, we saw a goose egg from someone like Cade Otton. Nonetheless, let's continue on to the quarterback conversation, as I will share, of course, the most advantageous matchups at the quarterback conversation with passing statistics isolated, just passing yards, passing touchdowns, and interceptions. The Chicago Bears, the Ravens, the Saints are the most advantageous matchups, while on the other end of this overall conversation, we have the Chargers, Rams, and Eagles as some of the most difficult matchups going into the given week. Of course, the Eagles taking on the Rams this week should be an interesting and exciting matchup. We'll have to wait and see. But until then, let's begin by talking about my number 1 at the quarterback conversation. It is Josh Allen, who over the course of his entire career against the Miami Dolphins has a 12-2 record. Again, he continues to find himself success against them, and tonight he is favored at home with a current 11.5 point spread. So when you have the advantage of home field advantage, first and foremost, just want to remind you guys, the Buffalo Bills haven't lost a game at home since week 10 of 2023. So we're going to probably be in a position in which Josh Allen finds himself a lot of success. Anytime Josh Allen over the course of the last 2 seasons, he has been a 9.5 point favorite or better. In those last 8 games, averaging 22.24 fantasy points per game, 7 of those 8 games with 2 touchdowns minimum. There's a lot of potential for upside. We know that we're firing him up in this Thursday night matchup. Number 2, we have Lamar Jackson taking on the Detroit Lions. Look, this game is a 52.5 point total. The expectation is a shootout, and if in fact that is going to take place, of course, anticipate Lamar Jackson to score his normal kind of fantasy point range. Over the course of the 2024 season, games in which Lamar Jackson was implicated within to have a 50 point total or more, In those 5 games, he was averaging 26.84 fantasy points per game. In 4 of those 5 games, 22 or more fantasy points. Of course, we're firing him up as the Lions are giving up 15.44 fantasy points per game just on passing statistics alone to opposing quarterbacks. Number 3, we have Jayden Daniels. Now, many of us are speculating whether or not Jayden Daniels is actually going to play this week. Obviously, we're waiting for his Friday status, as Wednesday and Thursday he has not participated in practice. And the head coach, Dan Quinn of the Washington Commanders, has come out and specifically said that we're not going to let him practice until Friday. As of right now, he is mentally preparing while Marcus Mariota is going to take the reps. So until then, we'll have to wait and see. In the event in which he does not play, obviously, let's look for a pivoting option. Hopefully, one of the members of today's top 16 rankings video, or you could potentially pivot in the direction of Marcus Mariota. As in 2024, in the 2 games in which he filled in for Jayden Daniels, against Carolina and Dallas, he scored 19.6 and 26.0 fantasy points. Expect for a lot of potential upside, regardless of whether it is Jayden Daniels this week or Marcus Mariota taking on the Las Vegas Raiders. Number 4, we have Patrick Mahomes, who, yes, is coming off of a week in which he had a 55% passing completion percentage, but has still been fantasy relevant for 2 consecutive games, considering he is the leading rusher of the Kansas City Chiefs, averaging 12.15 fantasy points per game on the ground thus far this season. Again, whenever you're the leading rusher of your offense, you've scored a rushing touchdown each of the last 2 games, and now you have an opportunity of taking on the Giants secondary, which is the 6th best matchup at the position. When you get back the services of someone like Xavier Worthy, Jalen Royals, if those kind of players are going to return, anticipate for the passing statistics to increase, not only because of the matchup, but because of the receiving help, and additionally, of course, for him to continue to scoot around with his legs. Our number 5 to close out this tier is Jalen Hurts. Look, like I mentioned earlier, this is one of the tougher matchups at the position. But when we talk about Jalen Hurts and his potential for success, any given week he could score 5 touchdowns and no one would bat an eye. But the only reason why Jalen Hurts sits at the A tier in our number 5 this week is because of the passing attempts that he's had over the course of this season thus far, 22 and 23. Even though this entire offseason I spoke to the idea of maybe Jalen Hurts is going to throw the ball more this season if Saquon Barkley isn't as efficient, well, that has not been the case. Last season he took on the Rams twice, once in the postseason, once in the regular season. In those games, scoring 18.1 and 15.1 fantasy points with 20 and 22 passing attempts. Expect for a very similar total, as in those games, Saquon Barkley totaled 205 and 255 rushing yards as he dominated against the LA Rams. And of course, they're going to try to key in on exactly that to find success this week, which of course will limit Jalen Hurts' upside. We move on to Caleb Williams as our number 6. Look, this is an advantageous matchup. I understand that Matt Eberflus, the new defensive coordinator of the Dallas Cowboys, is coming back into town to take on his former team, and he's going to be dialing up this defense to get after Caleb Williams. But with a 50.5 total and the Bears being home favorites this week, my expectation is that Caleb Williams should be able to put together another advantageous performance in which he is taking on the Dallas Cowboys defense that just got torched by Russell Wilson and the boys. Therefore, I would anticipate Caleb Williams to step up to the task on hand, make this a competitive shootout, and once he does so, whether it is on the ground, through the air, for him to be relevant in a top tier capacity. Moving on to our number 7, we have Justin Herbert, who, again, with all the weapons that surround him, he's going to be stable every single week within the passing category, regardless of what matchup. So despite the fact that he takes on the Denver Broncos this week, I have no concern, especially considering last season in the Week 16 matchup against Denver, 22.2 points, 284 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 8 rushing attempts for 28 rushing yards, which is very reminiscent as to what we have seen thus far this season, as Justin Herbert has ran the ball at a premium, accumulating 32 and 31 rushing yards in the last 2 games. Again, regardless of matchup, I would anticipate for him to be at an advantage point, considering all the weapons that surround him and his activeness within the rushing category. Number 28, we have Drake Maye, who's coming off of a game in which he had an 83% passing completion percentage against the Miami Dolphins, and now has an opportunity of taking on the Steelers defense that has struggled, not only through the air with injuries, of course, but also in terms of stopping the run. They are incapable of doing so. Thus far this season, Breece Hall, and of course the efforts of Justin Fields. And then in this most recent week, we saw, Kenneth Walker run all over that defense. They were averaging like 6 yards per carry, running to the left side of the offensive line, basically away from TJ Watt. All in all, once the play action opens up the opportunity for Drake Maye, he's going to be able to dice up the secondary that allowed 14.2 fantasy points per game just off passing statistics alone to Justin Fields and Sam Darnold. I would anticipate the scrambling ability of Drake Maye to continue to elevate his potential for upside, which keeps him within this B tier. Number 9. We have Daniel Jones. Look, the Colts haven't punted once this season thus far. Even though they technically did line up for a punt and then there was a penalty in which they eventually moved the chains there. Nonetheless, when you have Indiana Jones having scored 3 rushing touchdowns in the last 2 weeks, of course he's going to be fantasy relevant. Eventually, Jonathan Taylor is going to take away some of those rushing touchdowns, and it is going to diminish the potential upside for Daniel Jones. Nonetheless, this week they take on the Tennessee Titans, which in my mind is an advantageous matchup, which continues to provide more value for Daniel Jones, who has looked great thus far this season. This most recent game, of course, taking on a tough Denver secondary, but still having a 68% passing completion percentage and throwing for over 300 passing yards. Number 10, we have Dak Prescott in a very highly anticipated matchup, a potential shootout with a 50-point total. Again, the Bears currently, as of right now, are the favorites. And if Dak Prescott is going to be in a negative game script for the majority of this game, then anticipate a lot of passing, especially against the Bears secondary that has allowed the most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks thus far this season, as they just allowed Jared Goff to throw for just as many passing touchdowns as he has incompletions in week 2. Anticipate a lot of potential for upside for someone like Dak Prescott, and we're hoping that, of course, Javonte Williams doesn't steal too many touchdowns this upcoming week. Number 11, we have Baker Mayfield. Look, in terms of an 80% success rate, Baker Mayfield has been able to score 2 touchdowns in 16 of the last 20 games he has played for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Even though he will be missing 3 of his starting offensive linemen this week, it doesn't matter who has been missing, whether it has been Chris Godwin, Tristan Wirfs, Mike Evans, Bucky Irving, Rashad White. It doesn't matter who has ever missed time. I understand that missing offensive line help is certainly going to be impactful in terms of his ability to get the ball out of his hands and to his playmakers, but he has been a consistent option, and because of that high level of consistency and the fact that they take on a New York Jets offense that will be led by Tyrod Taylor, I believe that, of course, this defense for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to afford Baker Mayfield a lot more opportunities this week, which will keep him in this top 12 quarterback conversation for fantasy purposes. Number 12, we have Kyler Murray. Look, we could absolutely make the argument that Kyler Murray needs to be ranked higher. And that's mainly because, again, he does take on the San Francisco 49ers, which is a completely different matchup in comparison to what he has faced the last 2 weeks, taking on the Saints and Cardinals. Like I mentioned earlier, this week, with 9 minutes remaining in the third quarter, the Cardinals were up 27-3 against the Panthers. Kyler Murray didn't do much in that fourth quarter, even in the second half. Forget the fourth quarter. He didn't do much in the second half. So if we're going to be in a position in which these teams are going back and forth and competing consistently, then I would anticipate a lot more upside for Kyler Murray. Last season against the San Francisco 49ers, I understand it's different personnel, but he scored 24.1 and 27.9 fantasy points against that defense and secondary. We're hoping for similar levels of production. I would anticipate him not to get into that 24-plus point range, as, again, in one of those games, he threw for 4 touchdowns. In the other, he ran for over 100 yards. These are outlier performances based on the average of what a Kyler Murray is capable of accomplishing. But hey, maybe one of these weeks he'll find that upside. Number 13, we have Jordan Love. Look, Jordan Love's a fantastic player. As of right now, they're 7.5-point favorites on the road against Cleveland. The Browns are allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks this season. And if we're going to continue to give this offense for the Packers more and more opportunities based on how well this Packers defense has performed, they're going to force a lot of turnovers from Joe Flacco, which will afford a lot more opportunities to score within this, Green Bay Packers attack. And again, it's not going to always just be Josh Jacobs in the red zone. Hopefully we'll spread it out to guys like Romeo Doubs and, of course, Tucker Kraft for more upside there. Number 14, we have Jared Goff. Look, when you take on Baltimore with a 52.5-point total, I'm expecting this to be a high-scoring game. And if, in fact, that is going to take place, with the Ravens allowing 19.24 fantasy points per game off passing statistics isolated, then we should anticipate someone like Jared Goff, who's coming off of an incredible performance of an 82% passing completion percentage. And yes, I'll mention it again, 5 passing touchdowns and 5 incompletions against the Chicago Bears. I understand this secondary for the Ravens should be better, but we have seen many of quarterbacks, whether it was this season or last season, dominate against the secondary nonetheless, and Jared Goff should be able to follow suit. Number 15, we have Bo Nix. Look, Bo Nix is coming off of a great bounce-back performance of 3 passing touchdowns, 21 fantasy points, even though they did lose against the Indianapolis Colts. But again, when you take on the Chargers, who are allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, it does make me a little bit nervous. Luckily, Bo Nix, thus far in his career in the 2 matchups against the Chargers, has thrown for 2 touchdowns in both of those games. If he can find rushing upside, of course, it is going to allow him to stay within this top 16 conversation, despite the difficulty of taking on that Jesse Minter defense that the Los Angeles Chargers have been able to create over the course of the last 2 seasons here. Number 16, we have Trevor Lawrence, the final quarterback I wanted to mention. Look, Trevor Lawrence has not played well. He's going to continue to throw interceptions. He's going to continue to put his team into vulnerable positions. But what he is probably going to continue to also do is score fantasy points, because you do take on the Houston Texans this week. We saw the Buccaneers take them on Monday. Of course, Liam Cohen is a former offensive coordinator of that team and now the play caller of the Jaguars. Therefore, if he is going to use similar concepts to expose that Texans defense, expect for Trevor Lawrence to find himself advantages within the upcoming matchup, a week in which Brian Thomas Jr. will finally bounce back and show everybody, of course, how valuable he is for fantasy purposes. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to my quarterback and tight end rankings. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'm going to go ahead and put together a couple plays for tonight's game between the Buffalo Bills taking on the Miami Dolphins via Betr. Of course, be sure to go ahead, click the link down below. If you follow all of the instructions down in the description, of course, you'll get my Sunday morning rankings like I mentioned before. But let's go ahead and let's throw it up on screen. Let's travel on over to Betr, and let's talk about the potential of a couple plays that we're putting together tonight. Earlier this week, I mentioned the potential of taking more than 3.5 receptions for Devon Achane. And when we look at the potential of his success rate within this 3.5 category, in 11 of the last 13 games he has played with a healthy Tua Tagovailoa, he has gone more than 3.5 receptions. Therefore, we're leaning in this direction. Additionally, on top of it, in the last 2 games in which he has taken on the Buffalo Bills defense, he accumulated 7 and 8 receptions. So maybe even more potential for upside, especially considering a player like Jalen Waddle is questionable to play. So besides taking more on this specific play, we're going to go ahead and pair this up with, I have a couple plays here, but we're going to go ahead and pair this up with Dalton Kincaid tonight. Like I mentioned earlier, we're going to go more than 24.5 receiving yards. He's already accomplished it twice this season, but in 4 of the last 4 games against the Miami Dolphins, he has been able to accomplish it. The Dolphins thus far this season, in 2 games, have allowed 12 receptions and 143 receiving yards to opposing tight ends. Therefore, we should anticipate Dalton Kincaid to get himself a lot of looks. Now, the other players that are implicated within this play down below before we go ahead and continue on. First and foremost, the 2 players I just mentioned is one separate play. This other play consists of going more than 50.5 receiving yards from Tyreek Hill. This is a little bit of a discount play. The max in which you can enter on this play is $10. We're going more on that overall number because, again, he's been able to accomplish that in each of the last 2 games with a healthy Tua Tagovailoa against the Buffalo Bills. And, of course, in this most recent game against New England, going for over 100 yards. But alongside of him, as you can see on screen, I can go ahead and find it right here, I'm going more than 2.5 receptions for Khalil Shakir. Shakir, over the course of the last 3 consecutive games against the Miami Dolphins defense, has had 5 or more receptions in each of those games. This most recent week, of course, wasn't able to get himself more than 2.5 receptions, primarily because of the blowout victory against the New York Jets. Even though he disappeared, I trust that he's going to be able to accumulate 3 receptions or more within the upcoming matchup. So those are my 4 players that I like to go ahead and roll with this week. Potentially make some plays on your own. Check out Betr. Again, there's a link down in the description. I appreciate all the support in regards to that. The final thing I wanted to mention before I close out today's video is in regards to, again, for those of you who are looking for rankings, don't want to look towards Betr, you can always go ahead and find my rankings every Thursday and Sunday via Patreon. Of course, you'll get to ask me any and all fantasy football related questions, whether it is trade questions, waiver wire questions, starter sit questions, and of course get exclusive Discord community server access that is privated. So for those of you interested, check that out today. Again, I'll be back later tonight after the football game. Hopefully our plays hit. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.